Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's special presentation, I'm excited to be offering a new take on a subject I covered very early on in this channel, which is the top 10 most produced rifle patterns in history. In spring of 2022, I released a two-part series, linked in the description, in which I presented on the historical context of 10 of the most significant rifle patterns of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. Today we are revisiting those same 10 rifles by actually getting them out to the range and getting deep into the shooting experience and handling characteristics that they offer. As a bonus for this presentation, I enlisted the help of some pretty cool people. We got a lot to cover today, so let's get right into it. Before we head out to the range and introduce our special guests, let's briefly recap which rifles will be included on today's list and why. From highest to lowest production numbers, our collection of rifle patterns includes the Kalashnikov, the Mauser, the Mosin, the AR, the Lee-Enfield, the SKS, the Marlin Model 60, the Arisaka, the Garand, and finally, the G3. With that list established, let's head off 3 frequently asked questions that come up anytime I engage with this list. Question number 1, where did I get the production numbers I based my list on? Answer number 1, a few sources, but primarily N.R. Jens and Jones's paper, Global Development and Production of Self-Loading Service Rifles, 1896 to present. A few numbers, such as the SKS production numbers, were informed by my own research and areas of expertise. Question number 2, why are my production numbers for the Garand so much higher than anything you might see elsewhere on the internet? Answer number 2, because I'm looking at the Garand pattern, not the Garand rifle. Just as the Kalashnikov pattern includes rifles other than the AKM, and the Mauser pattern includes rifles other than the K98K, the Garand pattern includes rifles other than the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1. Of specific note would be the M14, M1A, and Ruger Mini series, which all clearly fall under the Garand pattern. And finally, question number 3, why didn't I include blank? Well, either because blank isn't a rifle or because there just weren't enough of blanks made. The Mossberg 500 and Remington 870 are shotgun patterns and therefore ineligible for this list, just as the Uzi pattern is a submachine gun pattern and also ineligible for this list. The FAL, Winchester 94, Marlin 336, and M1 carbine are indeed rifle patterns, but they just didn't make enough of them to be included. Had I gone by specific models rather than by patterns, the list would indeed be different, but that's not what I thought would be most interesting. If you want to make your own list, I'd love to watch it. With those out of the way, the last thing we need to talk about is exactly how these rifles were tested and who I got to help with testing. I do have pre-existing opinions and biases on most of the rifles included in this video, so I thought it'd be most interesting if I could work in some outside perspectives. To that end, I enlisted the help of 2 highly qualified individuals, both of whom I met while we were all serving in the maintenance section of a U.S. Army Special Forces Group Forward Support Company. Out of respect for those guys' privacy, I'm not going to be sharing their names or specific resumes, but suffice to say they are both well experienced in operating and maintaining conventional weapon systems in a professional military environment. It's not my intention to exaggerate or pretend like these guys are any cooler than they are. After all, we've already established they're friends with a nerd like me. The point is they do have substantially more experience than your average firearm enthusiast, let alone a member of the general public. As for testing criteria, this was extremely relaxed and informal. Pretty much all I did was lay out all 10 rifles on a flatbed along with some ammunition in the form of loaded magazines or clips. When necessary, I provided brief familiarizations on some of the more obsolete weapon systems that the shooters might not have been familiar with. And then from there, the shooters were free to do what they want, and they just seemed to take a mix of rested and offhand shots at torso-sized targets about 100 yards away, while I took notes on their impressions and feedback as we went. Just to be clear, we weren't shooting for groups, mostly because the inconsistencies between different bore conditions and ammunition types between weapons would have made that more or less useless, but we were evaluating the ability to get initial and follow-up shots on target. Additionally, despite the fact that all 3 shooters are technically USASOC qualified maintainers, we weren't breaking these weapons down or evaluating them from a maintenance perspective. Again, we were really just looking at the immediately apparent shooting and handling characteristics. So now that we know what's happening, let's start going down the list. First up was the G3 pattern, an iconic second-generation autoloading battle rifle born in the late 1950s out of a combined German and Spanish engineering effort. Although this ugly and utilitarian sledgehammer of a rifle was often overshadowed in NATO service by the more refined Belgian FAL, the G3 did exhibit higher production numbers of approximately 8 million and has ultimately proven itself to be the more enduring design, as it has been more readily adaptable to the evolving needs of modern warfighters. For this test, I provided a PTR-91 GIR, a US-made copy of the HK91. Overall, I do believe that this PTR rifle offered a very authentic G3 shooting experience with 2 caveats. The first would be the lack of select fire capability, obviously, as all subjects using this test were Title I firearms, so this isn't going to be the only firearm to which that applies. Additionally, my specific PTR-91 is equipped with aftermarket XS sights. I would have preferred to provide historically accurate iron sights. However, I personally hate the HK diopter drum due to my experiences with their tendency to exhibit lateral drift over time. With that in mind, I won't be providing any shooter feedback on the sights because they're not original and they don't actually reflect on the G3 pattern. Other than that, the feedback on the G3 was overwhelmingly negative. Both shooters commented that the recoil impulse and muzzle rise were excessive, even for a full power battle rifle. They found the rifle to be difficult to positively control, even on semi-auto, and agreed that they saw no conceivable use for select fire capability, which is consistent with reports I've heard from those who have firsthand experience. I personally have a soft spot for the G3 because I appreciate its history and I think that it's a whole lot of fun at the range. However, I do have to concur with the shooter assessments. The rifle is durable, reliable, and effective, and while no rifle which combines those traits should ever be underestimated, I think that's about all it has going for it. Even when compared to first-generation autoloaders like the Garand, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the G3 doesn't really have a lot to offer in its stock configuration. Obviously, there's a conversation to be had about modernized variants such as the Swedish AK-4D. However, for the purpose of this test, we try to limit our scope to basic configurations, and the basic configuration of the G3 pattern is not a particularly impressive or feature-packed weapon. Really, the only positive thing either shooter had to say about the G3 was that detachable 20-round box magazines are better than earlier first-generation feed systems. However, that's a pretty thin silver lining.
Good enough.
Next up was the Garand pattern, the legendary first-generation autoloading battle rifle, which earned immortality in the hands of that greatest generation who fought America's wars of the 1940s and 1950s. Including the later takes of the Garand pattern, such as the M14, M1A, and Ruger miniseries, the pattern has overall production numbers which exceed 8 million. For this test, I provided a 1941 Springfield Armory-produced M1 rifle, acquired from the Civilian Marksmanship Program in service grade. This is in every way a direct representation of those M1 rifles which saw heavy service in World War II and Korea. The shooter feedback for the Garand was extremely positive to the degree that I was initially surprised. Both shooters emphasized the exceptionally crisp trigger and the sights of the M1 and pointed out that the recoil impulse was notably more controllable than the G3 despite the marginally more powerful 30-06 cartridge and outdated ergonomic layout. In the conclusion of our test, I asked both shooters to identify which of the 10 rifles they would choose as a fighting rifle, and one shooter actually selected the Garand as his second choice behind the obvious first choice of the AR. I don't personally agree with this choice. However, after significant reflection, I have to admit that it's really a lot more reasonable than I might have initially suspected. Despite its obviously dated first-generation Mannlicher-style clip-driven feed system, the Garand really is an exceptionally functional rifle. The trigger and sights make it pretty easy to put rounds exactly where you want them, and the full-power cartridge pushes that capability well beyond intermediate rifle cartridge territory. No semi-automatic firearm that makes it that easy to reach out and touch somebody should ever be taken lightly. Additionally, despite the reduced capacity and relatively slow loading of the weapon, the stable recoil impulse actually allows for faster follow-up shots than something like the G3, and that shouldn't be overlooked either. Generally speaking, reloading is done from cover, whereas follow-up shots are taken from an exposed position, so there's an argument that the Garand is actually a faster rifle where it counts. Finally, just to double down on the accuracy piece, all three shooters, myself included, agreed that if we could only choose one rifle to take a single well-aimed shot at a distant target, we would all choose the M1 Garand, and that consensus in and of itself is noteworthy. I've always spoken highly of the Garand on this channel, and I do have some Garand-specific content in the pipeline, but for now, this experience was just another streamer for this old warhorse. The Garand was an absolute lion among men during its heyday, and it maintains an objectively impressive level of viability all these decades later.
Always satisfying.
Next up is the Arisaka pattern, the manually operated, improved Mauser 95 action, which saw continuous use through the rise and fall of the modern Japanese Empire. Estimates for total production numbers vary, however 8.5 to 9 million seems reasonable. For this test, I provided a 37th Series Type 99, produced in 1942 by the Tokyo Juki Kogyo Arsenal. It should be noted that Arisakas were made in both 6.5 and 7.7 millimeter varieties, and while on paper I think that the 6.5 was clearly a superior choice, at least for the infantry rifle role, 7.7 was what was available for us today. I should also note that due to the difficulty of sourcing 7.7 by 58 millimeter ammunition, this was actually my first time shooting this rifle, so this is really the only weapon today which I truly approached with a clean slate. Overall, the feedback for the Type 99 is that it was a solid but unexceptional rifle. Obviously, as this video goes on, we'll be establishing some direct competition between the 4 bolt-action rifles on the list, and as a bit of a spoiler, there was a clear winner, a clear loser, and 2 that fell somewhere in the middle. The Arisaka was one of the ones that came somewhere in the middle. The only significant complaint shooters offered had to do with a slightly creepy trigger press, which drew out a couple of flinches.
So low.
Yeah, I know.
Holy cow.
Right when you said flinch, I'm like, oh, this would be a great time to not flinch.
But otherwise, everyone seemed to agree that it was a very serviceable option as far as manually operated battle rifles go. The fixed aperture sight is a notable improvement over an open notch. However, its location forward of the action is not ideal. The weapon does cycle cleanly, but it's not exceptionally smooth either. As a personal note, I will add that I do think the weight and balance of the Type 99 is best in class, at least for manually operated battle rifles in this test. However, neither of the other shooters commented on this, so take that with a grain of salt. Really what I think it comes down to is that the Type 99 is a very solid rifle. However, there was one bolt-action rifle on the list which really stood out above the rest, and the Type 99 wasn't it. For now, I'll leave you to speculate on which bolt-action rifle did earn the nod from the shooters, and we will move on to the next rifle on the list.
Automatic. Got me used to those.
Number 7 on our list is the Marlin Model 60, a budget-priced auto-loading .22 rimfire, which also happens to be the only purely recreational firearm to make this list. The Marlin Model 60 made semi-automatic plinking and small game hunting affordable for generations of American young people, and consequently about 11 million of these things were made and sold. For this test, I provided my own Remlin-era Huntsville, Alabama-produced Marlin Model 60, which is heavily personalized but not meaningfully modified. For this rifle, I've replaced a ton of plastic components with either machined aluminum or brass. I've added tech sights, I've rotated and repinned the tube magazine to 90 degrees, and I've glass reinforced these sling swivel and cheap stock attachment points. Overall, however, the core action and handling characteristics of the rifle are unchanged. The reason I'm talking about personalizations to this rifle is because I don't have a whole lot else to talk about. The Marlin Model 60 is really in a category of its own and can't meaningfully be compared to any other rifle on this list. I've devoted a solid chunk of time on this channel to expressing my opinion that .22s are not toys. However, the Marlin Model 60 sure feels like a toy compared to the 9 military weapon systems that it shared the table with. The shooters were pleased to see that it flawlessly cycled the mixed bag of ammunition that we fed it, and they had no problem rapidly dumping rounds into our 100-yard target. However, at the end of the day, there isn't really much else to say. It's an entry-level plinker that somehow snuck its way onto a table full of fighting rifles, and the only thing it has in common with them is that a whole lot of them got made.
How many of these do they make?
More
than the Arisaka.
Yeah. 11 million?
Really?
Yep. Which is extremely impressive, once again, considering that you name any hunting rifle, any target rifle, nothing has got production numbers even close to that.
Moving on to number 6 on our list, we have a rifle which I know I was the most excited for, and I'm sure that more than a few of my regular viewers will be excited for as well. We are, of course, talking about the SKS pattern, a developmental oddity and first-generation auto-loading intermediate carbine, a niche which was made rapidly obsolete by the development of select-fire detachable box magazine-fed assault rifles. Most of my channel is devoted to celebrating the improbable and legendary success of the SKS, which saw about 15 million units produced, a majority of which are Chinese Type 56 carbines. For this test, I provided just such a Chinese Type 56 carbine, specifically a State Arsenal 416 example produced in 1972. In terms of shooter feedback, I am genuinely pleased to report that both shooters had overall positive impressions of the Type 56 carbine. We were joking about the SKS all morning, as my well-documented obsession with this outdated communist weapon has been a well-deserved source of teasing since our days together in the motor pool. However, both shooters begrudgingly admitted that the charm of the SKS is indeed self-evident once you start to pull that trigger. These sights and feed system are not ideal, but they do work, and the weapon is otherwise a light, handy, and soft shooting little carbine. Both shooters complemented the trigger, although for full disclosure, SKS triggers can vary fairly dramatically, and I did choose an example with an above average break. Also, I was more than happy to demonstrate the legendary durability of this weapon and the joy of owning a weapon system which can truly take a beating without complaint. As I previously mentioned, we didn't have time to really get into the guts of these rifles, but I feel inclined to state my personal opinion that the SKS is by far the most simple auto-loading rifle that graced this table today, with the fewest failure points. As I've stated again and again on this channel, the SKS is conceptually flawed, but its mechanical engineering is nearly perfect. I will say I was a bit disappointed that neither shooter selected the SKS for their short list for go-to fighting rifles. However, they did unequivocally validate what I've been saying about the SKS all along, which is that while it is far from the best choice, it is a shockingly pleasant and usable rifle, which should never be underestimated.
Yeah, so you're in for a treat, Joy.
So after I'm done firing, do I chunk this out?
You're more than welcome to.
Okay.
You're absolutely more than welcome to.
Do it.
Yeah.
Just fix bayonets and throw it. I feel like I'm in
Weapon
an
is
ad.
clear.
Yeah. Oh.
He's a nut job.
I meant more like a spear.
Oh, he did that last time too.
All right, moving on to number 5 on the list, we have the Lee-Enfield pattern. This is, of course, the British Commonwealth's take on the manually operated battle rifle, which saw about 16 to 7 million units produced across a number of iterations. For this test, I provided a number 4 Mark I produced at Royal Ordnance Factory Fazakerley in Liverpool, England in 1948. So as many of you have already deduced, this is the moment in the video where one way or another, we're going to find out which of the 4 bolt-action rifles came out as the shooter favorite. As we've previously established, there was a clear winner, and we know it wasn't the Arisaka. We also know that one of the remaining 3 is a Mosin, and as much as I do sincerely love Mosins, we'll talk about that in a minute, if you really thought the Mosin was going to come out on top, you need to put the vodka down, log out of Tarkov, and reconnect with reality for a bit. We all know this was a competition between the Mauser and the Lee-Enfield, and the winner was the Lee-Enfield by a landslide. I will admit to you, I did not see this coming, but upon reflection, I 100% agree with the shooters, so let's break down why. For full disclosure, most of my personal Lee-Enfield trigger time is on World War I era number 1 Mark IIIs, as I went through a phase of desporterizing and rebuilding such rifles in my early 20s. Those are super cool and historically significant rifles, but they never really impressed me compared to the Mausers, which I was collecting and shooting around the same time. And ultimately, I went down a big Mauser rabbit hole and kind of lost interest in the Enfield pattern as a whole. The thing is, the number 4 Mark I is clearly a totally different animal than the earlier short magazine Lee-Enfield, and I'm starting to think I made a mistake in overlooking it all those years. What it really comes down to is that the number 4 absolutely smoked all the other bolt guns in every category that really matters. It has twice the magazine capacity, and despite the rimmed 303 British cartridge, the clips feed really well. I intentionally loaded a few clips improperly to try to induce rim lock, and we had no hiccups whatsoever. Speaking of no hiccups, the action of this rifle is slick as glass. And the bolt never leaves its tracks. You don't need to be mindful of bolt return angle the way you do with a Mauser action. It really does cycle smoother, faster, and more cleanly than any other bolt gun we shot today. Finally, the sights are excellent. Not only does it offer apertures for both battle and precision settings, but those apertures are located behind the action, which facilitates faster, more precise, and more intuitive shooting. The best way I can describe the number 4 Mark I is that it feels like a manually operated M1 Garand in the hand. It's way slower than an autoloader, but it's very, very fast for a bolt gun. And just like the Garand, it makes it really easy to put rounds exactly where you want them. I will freely admit that I came into this test rooting for the 98 Mauser, but I am capable of recognizing when I was wrong, and the Lee-Enfield absolutely stomped every other bolt gun on this table. Does this mean I'm going to stop shooting and enjoying my Swedish Mausers and Finnish Mosins? Of course not. Those are phenomenal rifles in their own right. I have, however, reached a point where I think I am finally ready to admit that the Lee-Enfield pattern doesn't just have a seat at the table, but may have a compelling claim to the bolt gun throne. If nothing else, my takeaway from this test is I want to spend some more time with that rifle.
This is a Lee-Enfield number 4 Mark I. So this is the, in theory, this is the British service rifle or Commonwealth service rifle for World War II.
Okay.
but like many countries in World War II, their logistics was fucked, so they primarily used World War I era rifles.
Okay.
But if they would have been on top of it, this is what they would have used. So like the best guys got these. This is 303 British, it's a rimmed cartridge. Oftentimes rimmed cartridges create feeding issues.
You stacked them right, didn't you?
Well, the thing with the British is that you really, really don't need to. Like, watch
Really?
this. So this is going to be noteworthy. I will intentionally go under, over, under, over.
Okay.
So, like, for example, if we were to do that with the Mosin,
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
it'd be a nightmare.
Yeah.
But load that one and watch, you're going to have no problems.
Okay. Is this one of those that you had to armor over the action?
Say it one more time.
Is this the one that you tried beforehand?
Yes. We've already done one of them, so we're good.
Yeah.
Honestly, if the headspace was sketchy on any of them, it was the Arisaka. This one was fine.
Right. Yeah, good. That's good.
Moving on to number 4 on our list, we have the ArmaLite Rifle pattern, or AR. This pattern obviously needs a little introduction. It has served as the primary fighting rifle for the United States since the Vietnam War. Additionally, the AR is the unofficial long gun of the constitutionally armed American civilian populace, a fact which has contributed to staggering total production numbers, which are at least 20 million, although in reality are probably many times that. For today's test, I provided a Title I clone of an M4A1 carbine, part for part interchangeable with the U.S. Army service rifle best known to all 3 shooters, with the only exception being an extended pinned and welded A2 flash hider and an absent autosear. Unsurprisingly, there's not a lot to say about the AR other than it was clearly the best weapon system on the table that day. Some cognitively impaired viewers of my channel have accused me of not liking the AR enough and have taken it upon themselves to explain the merits of my own service rifle to me, but that doesn't change the fact that I have historically and continue to recognize the AR as the gold standard for modern fighting rifles. 2 of the 3 shooters in today's video, myself being one of them, have held the MOS 91 Fox, which means that we recognize the pros and cons of the weapon from a maintainer perspective. However, at the end of the day, it is a weapon of unparalleled ergonomics, modularity, and usability. It's light, handy, controllable, flat shooting, and effective. AR triggers range from very good to excellent, and while I personally hate the Matech backup iron sights we were using, the beauty of an AR is that you are literally seconds away from whatever configuration of cutting-edge enablers that you desire. When I asked the shooters which weapon they would choose for serious use, I actually qualified that question by saying other than the AR, and nobody felt the need to correct me.
Yeah,
So this goes in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. In the side here.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Like a stab over there. It's tight.
There might have been a reason that the unit got rid of that magazine. I don't know.
Not the horses.
Yeah. Not the elderly senior horses.
All right, here we are finally in the top 3, with number 3 itself being the Mosin pattern. Despite being one of the most historically crude firearm designs, this weapon system has seen more or less continuous use since the late 1800s and played a central role in the Eastern Front of World War II, which saw the largest scale fighting in human history. This isn't a history video, but I feel morally obliged to remind viewers that during the peak of fighting in the 1940s, the Russians had more soldiers killed in action in a 6-month period than the total number of Americans who have died in war since the Revolutionary War. The scale we're talking about here is staggering, which is a large part of why 37 million of these rifles got made. In any case, for today's test, I provided a Chinese Type 53 carbine produced at the people's favorite weapons factory, State Arsenal 296 in 1955. I will say that I did consider bringing out one of my best Finnish M30s for this test, and I'm sure that a few of you are going to be disappointed that I did not. However, one of our shooters had never fired a Mosin carbine before, and frankly, I think that Mosin carbines are one of the most fun firearms to take to a range, period, so that's what I chose to bring. Feedback for the Mosin was pretty much what I think that most rational people would expect. Despite the enjoyable daytime fireballs and sinus-clearing concussive blast that it provides, especially when you're firing over a hard surface, it's quite clearly the worst of the manually operated battle rifles. The highest praise I have ever personally heard attributed to a Mosin trigger is "not that bad," which if nothing else highlights that some of them really are that bad. Additionally, depending on the properties of the specific example and ammo type you are using, Mosins display a strong tendency towards sticky cycling, which we did observe during our test. Additionally, Mosin stripper clips are at best a slight improvement over single loading, and at worst, they are actually less efficient. And before you ask, I did use a combination of authentic Soviet Ishevsk marked and Bulgarian Circle 10 marked clips, purchased specifically for this video. So don't think I was complaining about some knockoff Chinese garbage. Don't get me wrong, I am personally a huge fan of the Mosin platform. Believe it or not, I have a 7.62 by 54R themed tattoo, but I personally think it is incumbent upon intellectually honest Mosin enthusiasts to recognize that this is an ugly and uninspired rifle designed for an ugly and uninspired flavor of warfare. Yes, some Mosins are better than others. As I mentioned, I have a finished tack driver with a worked over trigger that I could have pulled out, but even that rifle is still built on a fundamentally sticky Soviet action. Even the best Mosin is still a Mosin, and the Mosin is an ugly war pig of a rifle. It reliably shoots a very powerful round in a reasonably predictable manner, and that should never be underestimated, but that's about all it does.
All right.
Fireball time.
All right. Forgot how sloppy these triggers are on these.
There's a trend with the Russian and Chinese stuff where it's like, no, it's when in doubt, just no.
It's a good fireball and you can see it in broad daylight.
Exactly.
Oh, fuck's sake.
I mean, that's part of how this goes. Like, I literally bought the right clips that are just getting tossed for today.
Spent money on those?
I did, yes. Like $7 a piece. They're Bulgarian. Yeah, they're supposed to come with a mallet, but I forgot the mallet.
Moving on to number 2, we of course have the Mauser 98 pattern, a German-born manually operated battle rifle, which in many ways came to define the bolt-action category as a whole. It entered the 20th century as the gold standard for infantry fighting rifles and persists today in modern sporting variants with a staggering production total which probably exceeds 100 million. For today's test, I thought there would be no better example to bust out than my 1937 produced Sauer & Son K98K, the backbone of the Wehrmacht and undoubtedly the most notorious of all Mauser variants. Feedback for the Mauser was a bit surprising for me, considering that I've already admitted that this was my pick for what I expected to be the most popular bolt gun of the day, and it fell decidedly short. That said, everything the shooter said was extremely reasonable, and in retrospect, kind of predictable, so let's break it down. First of all, the K98K ran flawlessly as one would expect. It is a very, very solid and proven rifle. The thing is, despite its notoriety, a lot of the basic features are surprisingly mediocre. For starters, the shooters commented on the trigger being long and creepy, even in comparison to the Mosin that they just finished shooting. Additionally, the action isn't particularly smooth. It's extremely usable, but it has a couple of friction points, and in order to run it quickly, you really need to be conscious about your directional output to avoid binding, especially when the action is fully open. The notch and post sights positioned forward of the action aren't any better than the Mosin sights. They're significantly worse than the Type 99 sights, and they aren't even in the same category as the number 4 Enfield. Finally, 8x57mm was the most powerful cartridge of the day, and the K98K does very little to shield the shooter's shoulder from Newton's third law of motion. At the end of the day, shooters weren't necessarily critical of the K98K, as it's clearly a very usable weapon system, but it really fell short of expectations, especially in direct comparison to the Lee-Enfield. In my opinion, there is a factor which merits discussion here, and that is expectation bias. I've long claimed on this channel that German guns specifically tend to fall short of shooters' expectations, not because they're bad firearms, they're usually very good, but because German engineering has been so effectively mythologized within popular culture. Just as an example, I remember watching movies like Die Hard and The Matrix as a kid, and subsequently developing the belief that MP5s must be like Rolexes made by an advanced alien species. Many years later, when I first had an MP5 put in my hands, I was rather surprised to discover that they're actually pretty crude amalgamations of stamped sheet metal and welds, not unlike the G3s that they're based on. Now, don't get me wrong, the MP5 is still one of the best subguns ever devised, but my point is that it simply didn't live up to the legendary expectations I had built for it. Just as a fun peek to the other side of the coin, I do think this is why a lot of times people are really impressed by Chinese and Spanish guns because they expect them to be made of melted down tin cans and cast iron skillets, and subsequently they end up impressed as long as they don't blow up in their hands. All that is to say, I still think the Mauser 98 is a phenomenal weapon which is well deserving of its legacy. It's just not as magical or special as some people might expect. The beauty of the 98 has always been action strength and reliability, not exceptional handling, accuracy, or shooting characteristics. Additionally, despite its notoriety, the K98K is far from the best in the military Mauser family, and there's probably a reason I find myself gravitating towards examples that are in cartridges like 6.5 by 55 and 7 by 57.
This is a 1937 Sauer & Son. So this is the same Sauer of Sig Sauer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Back before they were politically correct. So next time Sig Sauer wins a U.S. Army contract, just remember they try to take over the world twice.
Not once, but twice.
Yeah. And came surprisingly close both times.
Lee-Enfield seems to be the smoothest
Yeah.
for sure. Mosin obviously it's inconsistent and grainy.
Yeah.
Even this one, I mean, you would think it'd be a little bit more sophisticated, maybe better quality, but it's just as grainy as the Mosin.
And here we are finally at the top of our list, the most produced firearm in human history, the Kalashnikov. The brainchild of a humble Soviet tanker, it would be an understatement to call this weapon iconic, as there are indeed relatively few icons in human society that have had a more potent impact than the Kalash. Production numbers are purely speculative, but 150 million is probably somewhere in the ballpark. For this test, I supplied a Serbian-made ZPAP M70, which among the examples I had access to was the closest I could get to a standard Title I AKM. Feedback for the AK was pretty much what you might expect. The shooters naturally described the AK in direct comparison to the AR, and unsurprisingly emphasized its shortcomings within that context. First, the ergonomics of the AK magazine interface and safety are much less refined than the AR. Obviously, training is a factor, and on one hand, it should come as no surprise that 3 U.S. trained soldiers would prefer an AR to the AK. However, on the other side of that coin is the reality that the AR is a fundamentally more efficient weapon system to operate. It requires less movement to accomplish these same tasks. Additionally, the AK's open iron sights are basic, uninspired, and have the shortest radius of any weapon on the table, making them technically the worst sighting system on the table today. Next, a hefty 30 caliber bullet combined with a heavy and high-riding cyclic mass creates a distinct rocking recoil impulse, which compares poorly to the very flat-shooting AR. Additionally, all 3 shooters found that while the trigger was relatively light, especially compared to the Mauser, which we had just fired, it was unpredictable. AK triggers do vary, but often lack the sharp and predictable wall of an AR trigger, and despite the old marksmanship adage, no professional at arms actually wants to be surprised when their weapon goes off. You can see in this clip that my first shot on the M70 actually did break before I expected, and it surprised me. Obviously, the shot was still on target, but that was not a great feeling. All that said, my goal here is not to be critical of the AK. It's a phenomenally utilitarian weapon that didn't end up on the top of this list by accident. By many measures, it is the greatest weapon system in human history. It only sounds like critical feedback in this context because it's being directly compared to the AR, which is the only directly comparable weapon on the table, and many of us, myself included, consider the AR to be the most efficient modern small arm, and that's a pretty high bar to match as well. As I previously mentioned, all 3 shooters agreed that the AR was the best choice for a fighting rifle. However, 2 of the 3 shooters, again myself being one of them, agreed that the AK came in a very close second. As I've mentioned before on this channel, my personal SHTF, if you will, rifle is actually an AK variant, specifically an Arsenal SAM-7 SF. Once again, this is informed by my experience as a U.S. Army small arms maintainer, as I do understand that while a working M4 provides superior handling characteristics to an AK, it does carry a significantly higher maintenance burden. As fun as it is to get lectured to by guys who shoot 1,500 rounds a year, I know from experience that I don't feel confident taking an AR anywhere for an extended period of time without a complete spare gas system to include bolt, gas rings, gas tube, gas key, buffer tube, and buffer spring. All of these parts can go down hard, and if and when they do, you will need to replace them. I personally don't find that I need spare parts to feel confident with an AK. That's pretty sweet. And that's the video, guys. At the end of the day, my goal wasn't to convince anyone of anything or establish anything resembling definitive rankings, but rather just to share the unfiltered impressions of a few trained shooters on an eclectic collection of historically significant rifles. In summary, the number 4 Mark I Lee-Enfield emerged as a dark horse champion for the day, a rifle which significantly outperformed all of the shooter's expectations, myself certainly included. Honorable mentions go to both the Garand and the SKS, both of which demonstrated that they are surprisingly viable and endearing platforms despite their advanced age. On the other side of the coin, the K98K and G3 both earned surprisingly critical reviews. Obviously they're solid rifles, but they didn't quite live up to the hype. Finally, the AR-AK Mosin Model 16 Arisaka performed just about exactly as I think that most reasonable people would have expected. I'm sure there are a few highly opinionated and suspiciously emotionally invested folks out there who will vehemently disagree, but I do think our overall impressions of these rifles are fairly consistent with the wider consensus among the shooting public. All that said, I should probably note that however complimentary or critical I may have been to any specific rifle patterns today, it should be noted that we fired several hundred rounds without any single misfire or meaningful malfunction, so I can't say that any rifle failed to earn its place on this list. At the end of the day, every shooter could pick up any rifle on this table and promptly put holes in a 100-yard torso, and sometimes that's all that counts. So that's where we're going to call it today. I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, or feedback in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video and you're interested in seeing more videos like this in the future, I humbly ask that you let me know by hitting any combination of like, subscribe, or comment. That's what motivates me to keep going. Until next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day.